Welcome, Night Owl. I'm happy you're here for tonight's tales from the past. They will help you relax and drift off to sleep. We will look at the lives of the most infamous and cruel medieval kings. As we get started, please share in the comments where in the world you are and what time it is for you right now. If you like this style of calm historical storytelling, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Tonight, we'll be exploring the lives and legacies of some of medieval history's most infamous monarchs. These were kings whose reigns were marked by cruelty, instability, or strange behavior. We'll explore the different aspects of power, how mental illness can affect people, and the long-lasting effects these rulers had on their kingdoms and the world. So, get comfortable, relax, and let me show you what medieval Europe was like. Our story starts in 14th century France. There, we will meet a king who started his reign with great promise, but who later descended into chaos and turmoil as madness took hold of his mind. Charles V, the sixth of France, was only 11 years old when he became king in 1380. When he first became king, people loved him and called him Charles the Beloved. He was a young, energetic man who was known for being kind, charming, and for throwing great parties. It looked like the future of France was going to be good under his leadership. But one winter night in 1393, the course of Charles's life and kingship changed forever. The king and some nobles were at a fancy party at the royal palace. The men, including Charles, were dressed as wild men. They wore costumes made of linen soaked with resin or pitch. This was to make them look like savages. As the dancing began, disaster struck. One day, the king's brother Louis, the Duke of Orleans, got too close to the dancers with a torch. The highly flammable costumes caught fire instantly, engulfing the men in flames. There was chaos and screams in the hall. The Duchess of Berry threw her robe over the king to save his life, but 4 of the noblemen were badly burned and died in agony a few days later. Charles didn't get hurt, but the Bal d'Esserang, or the Ball of the Burning Men, as it's now known, left deep psychological scars. After that, the king started to show signs of being mentally unwell and unstable. People whispered that he had gone mad from the shock. His behavior became more and more strange and upsetting. Sometimes he would run quickly through the palace corridors, howling like a wolf and saying that he was made of glass and might break at any moment. He would often forget his name and title and wouldn't recognize his wife or children. He was so sure he was St. George that he had the royal symbols changed to show this. For months, he refused to bathe, change his clothes, cut his hair or nails. People who knew him well described how he looked and acted with pity and disgust. They said he would wear old, dirty clothes, and his hair was unkempt and dirty. Charles was gentle and sad when he was himself. He was very worried about his own situation. But as his illness got worse, these moments of clarity became less and less common. As Charles became more and more ill, France started to fall apart around him. When the king was unable to rule, different groups fought to gain power. The king's times of madness created a situation where there was no one to lead, which made the whole kingdom unstable. Charles's rule was marked by increasing problems in his country and in other countries. Power and influence were important to nobles who wanted to be more important than others. Their arguments are causing problems in the country. At the same time, England took advantage of France's weaknesses to make its own claims to the French throne, which led to the start of the 100 Years' War again. Charles was in and out of consciousness. He is king in name only. When he was able to think clearly, he tried to do his royal duties and make his divided kingdom more stable. But these moments got less and less common. Most of the time, he spent his days in a pitiful state. He was unable to rule, and he couldn't understand his own situation. There are sad stories about the Mad King, but also happy ones. Charles met one of his old friends, a knight he hadn't seen in years, during a short break from his illness. Charles was surprised to see him at court and asked why he had come. With tears in his eyes, the old knight replied, "I'm so happy to see you, my king, because it's been a long time since I last saw you." Charles embraced him and wept, saying, "My good friend, you are one of my best knights and friends. Stay with me. You are most welcome." For a moment, the king had stopped being crazy. He was calm and happy with what he saw, because he could see that his servants loved and trusted him. But these moments didn't last long. As time went on, Charles became more and more withdrawn and started to spend most of his time alone. He was lost in the maze of his own failing mind. By the time he died, he had become a very different person to the lively young man who had been France's bright future. When he died in 1422, his son Charles II had already started ruling in his place. Charles V's reign, which began with great hope, ended in sadness and confusion. The king, who the people had once loved so much, spent his final years a broken man. Sometimes he was pitiful, and sometimes he was terrifying because of the things he believed. His sad story shows how important it is for a king to be mentally stable, in an age where kings had complete, but often weak power. We then move on to another king who was also mentally unwell. Henry VI was also gentle, religious, and intelligent. But, like his French counterpart, he would find the pressures of kingship too much to bear, with devastating consequences for his realm. Henry's rule was trouble from the start, because he became king when he was only 9 months old. This made him too young to rule on his own. The regents ruled in his name, but other groups were plotting to take control of the young king, as they wanted to rule the kingdom through him. The early years of Henry's reign were marked by a fierce fight for power between the king's ambitious relatives and advisors. Even as a youngster, Henry preferred religion and learning to the skills needed to be a king. He was a deeply religious man who enjoyed going to church every day and spent a lot of time praying and thinking about his beliefs. He was also a keen scholar who loved reading and was interested in education. Henry went on to set up 2 of England's oldest and most respected universities, Eton College and King's College, Cambridge. Henry was kind, which made people like him, but this made it hard for him to compete with other people for power. As he grew up and started his royal duties, he found it hard to stop the different groups from arguing and make everyone in his kingdom get along. The worst thing to happen to Henry's reign was in August 1453. One day, the king suddenly fell into a deep sleep. He was unable to speak, recognize anyone, or respond to any stimuli. For more than a year, he was like this, not even reacting to the birth of his son. Henry's strange illness caused problems in his kingdom, just like his grandfather Charles V's strange illness had done. They were both the same in how they acted and what happened to them. With the king unable to lead, old arguments between families became violent. The tension between the houses of Lancaster and York, 2 smaller branches of the Plantagenet royal family, had been building up for some time. It reached a head when the 2 sides went to war, each wanting to be the best. This fight is known as the Wars of the Roses because the flags of the 2 sides were red and white roses. Even when Henry briefly stopped being in a coma in late 1454, he found it hard to take control of the chaotic political situation. By 1455, the Yorkies felt brave enough to fight against the king's Lancastrian supporters, winning the first battle of St. Albans. Henry was captured by the Yorkists and made to acknowledge their leader, Richard, Duke of York, as Lord Protector of the realm. In the years that followed, England was torn apart by civil war. The unlucky Henry was moved from one side to the other. When the king lost his senses, the 2 sides would start fighting again. They would try to take control of the king and his throne. When Henry was feeling mad, he acted like a child. He had to be fed, washed, and dressed like a baby. The scholar, who used to love his books and papers, no longer enjoyed them. He didn't seem to recognize his wife or son. Most people thought the king was completely lost in his own thoughts, like a vessel with no will or sense. Henry briefly regained his throne with the help of the Lancastrians in 1470. But by this point, he was a king in name only. He was a weak puppet controlled by his ambitious Queen Margaret of Anjou and the cruel Earl of Warwick. Less than a year later, the Yorkists attacked again, captured Henry, and forced him to give up his throne to the Yorkist king Edward IV. The sad final chapter of Henry's life took place in the Tower of London, where he was imprisoned by King Edward. There, abandoned by his allies and without his crown, Henry's already shaky hold on reality completely disappeared. When he heard that his young son had died at the Battle of Tewkesbury, he didn't seem to care. He was too busy thinking about his own problems. Just a few days later, on the night of May 21st, 1471, Henry himself was dead. He was found lifeless in his room under strange circumstances. The official account said he died from feeling unhappy and sad, but many people at the time thought someone had deliberately caused his death, and they thought the Yorkist king was to blame. This is how the sad life of Henry V, VI ended. He was a kind king, but he was born at a time when people were cruel. His many years as king were marked by times when he was not mentally well, which caused problems for the royal family and made England go through a difficult period in its history. Henry's sad story is similar to that of Charles the Mad across the channel. This shows that a king's mental health can greatly affect the luck of a whole nation. We then travel from England to Scandinavia to meet another ruler from the 16th century whose promising reign was ruined by paranoia and madness. Eric XIV of Sweden had all the qualities needed to be a strong king. He was well-educated, well-read, and charismatic. But, like Charles and Henry before him, he would also become mentally ill, and this would have very bad consequences for his kingdom. Eric became king of Sweden in 1560 after his father Gustav I died. Eric was a strong ruler and did a good job at first. He was a big supporter of the arts and sciences, and he was a very good scholar, poet, and composer. But even at his amazing coronation, there were signs of the strange behavior and beliefs that would later take over his life. As time went on, Eric started to feel more and more suspicious and paranoid. He saw threats everywhere and believed that his nobles and the aristocracy of nearby Denmark and Poland were planning to overthrow him and steal his crown. His chief advisor, Arun Persson, made the king more worried about this. He did this to get rid of his own political enemies. Eric's personal life was also very ups and downs. Early in his reign, he fell in love with Karen Mons, a beautiful commoner who had been a maid in the royal household. Against all the usual practice and the warnings of his advisors, Eric secretly married Karen in 1567 and had her crowned as queen. Although the marriage caused a scandal, Karen was loyal to Eric and stayed with him even during his darkest days. The most important event of Eric's rule was in 1567, when the Stura murders happened. Eric was sure that the Stura noble family and their friends were planning to do him in. He put a number of them in prison and had them put on trial for things they didn't do. The king was so angry and paranoid that he stabbed and killed one of the nobles, Niels Stura, during an interrogation. 2 other Stura lords and several of their associates were later killed on Eric's orders. The Stuart murders shocked the nation and made people feel bad about the king, who was becoming more and more unstable. Eric's behavior became more and more strange and unreal. He became obsessed with astrology and the occult, convinced he could read the future in the stars. He would have times when he felt very excited, and times when he felt very sad. Sometimes he thought he was a god and wanted his servants to worship him. As more and more people started to oppose Eric's rule, his own brothers, John and Charles, saw this as the chance to take advantage of the situation and start a rebellion against him. In 1568, they successfully deposed Erik, forcing him to abdicate in favor of John III. Most of the Swedish nobility supported the coup, as they were tired of the king's cruel and crazy rule. Erik's final years were very sad, and he got worse and worse mentally. The king, who had been deposed, was locked up in a series of castles by his brother. This made him even more crazy. He was sure he was not Erik XIV, but someone else. His devoted wife, Karen, stayed with him while he was being held captive. She was the only person who could calm him down when he was worried or upset. After being locked up for almost 10 years, the 43-year-old Erik died in 1577. It is thought that he was poisoned on the orders of his brother, and he was buried quickly and without any kind of funeral. John III was worried about the fragility of royal power and the constant threat of a crisis in succession. Erik XIV's story is a sad example of what can happen when someone is not given the chance to show what they can do. He was a gifted, educated, and cultured man who showed great promise as a ruler. But, like many kings, he could not cope with the huge pressures and worries of being king. His mind, unraveling, led him down a path of tyranny and terror. This undid his achievements and ruptured the kingdom. Heading further east to Russia, we arrive at the disturbing story of another ruler who was driven mad by paranoia and a terrible mental illness. Ivan Ivanovich Vassilevich, also known as Ivan the Terrible, was the first Grand Prince of Moscow to officially take on the title of Tsar of all of Russia. He ruled for nearly 40 years and changed Russia a lot, but he also caused a lot of chaos and cruelty in his country. Ivan had a difficult childhood. He experienced many challenges and felt insecure. He lost both his parents by the time he was 8. He grew up under the control of ambitious nobles and relatives who were fighting to control the regency. The young Ivan learned to be afraid and saw enemies and conspiracies everywhere. These early experiences made him the kind of leader who would later be known for being cruel and ruthless. When Ivan grew up and took control in 1547, he quickly started to make the boy nobility follow his orders. He was talented and energetic, and he won a series of impressive battles against Russia's enemies, making his country bigger. He introduced a number of popular reforms, including changes to the country's laws and the first meeting of Russia's parliament. Because of these successes, Ivan's early reign was relatively stable and successful. But as time went on, Ivan's behavior became more and more strange, suspicious, and violent. He thought the boyars were planning to betray him. He was set on stopping his plans and taking his power. He became extremely angry in 1565 and suddenly left Moscow. He even said he would give up his position as ruler. In a clever move, Ivan agreed to return only if he was allowed to punish traitors and enemies of the state however he saw fit. The boys felt pressured, and so they agreed. When he came back, Ivan started to scare the nobles, took their land, and killed or sent away anyone he thought was a threat. To enforce his will, he created the Opretniki, a brutal group of secret police who were fanatically loyal to him alone. In the following years, Ivan earned his nickname, the Terrible, as he caused great harm to Russia. Driven by paranoia and a desire for cruel punishment, he killed anyone he thought was a traitor. Torture, public executions, and mass killings became common. He even destroyed entire noble families, towns, and the city of Novgorod to stop people he thought were conspiring against him. The second part of Ivan's reign was also a tragic time for him personally, and made him even more crazy and cruel. In 1581, during a fierce argument, Ivan hit his daughter-in-law, which caused her to lose the baby. His eldest son, Ivan Ivanovich, got really angry and started yelling at his dad. Ivan the Terrible hit his son on the head with his staff. It was so hard that it killed him. Ivan was grief-stricken and felt guilty. He raved and shouted, praying for forgiveness and ordering more executions. The death of his son and heir was a huge personal tragedy for him, but was also very bad for the Russian royal family. Even the remaining sons were not fit to rule. The middle son was born disabled, and the youngest was a bad man. As we learn more about medieval kings and queens who were crazy, we look to the huge country of Russia. Here we find a king whose legacy is complicated and violent. Ivan Ivanovich Vassilevich, better known as Ivan the Terrible. Ivan was born in 1530, and his early life was sad and difficult. He was only 3 years old when his father, Vasily III, died from infected sore on his leg. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, was in charge for a time, but she also died when Ivan was only 8, probably murdered. These deaths left young Ivan without parents, and the court became a place of fighting between different groups of boys, each wanting to be in charge of the young ruler. Picture how scared and lonely young Ivan must have felt in a court full of people with their own secret plans and hidden intentions. When he was young, he was often ignored and left to walk around the palace on his own with only his younger brother for company. People say that the boys who were supposed to take care of him instead made fun of him and scared him, and even let him go hungry. These early experiences definitely had a big effect on Ivan and made him distrustful and paranoid in later life. Despite these challenges, or maybe because of them, Ivan grew up to be a smart and determined young person. By the time he was 16, he was already showing that he was a force to be reckoned with. He was starting to show that he wanted to be in charge, and he had Andrei Shwisky, the head of the boyars, arrested. Shwisky was dragged from the palace, beaten, and thrown into a dungeon where he was attacked by hungry dogs. This was a sign of the brutality that would become common during Ivan's reign. But Ivan's early years weren't all bad. In 1547, at the age of 16, he was crowned Tsar of all the Rus, the first person to hold this important title. His coronation was a grand event, a show of power and ceremony that made people recognize his authority. That same year, he married his first wife, Anastasia Romanova, a woman he seems to have truly loved. At first, it looked like Ivan's time as king might be good. Ivan was a successful ruler in the early years of his reign. He introduced a number of popular reforms. These included changes to the law code, which limited the power of the boyars. He even set up a system of local self-government. He also led the first Sky Sober Assembly in the country. This was a big meeting of people from all over Russia. They talked about important country issues. These early changes made Ivan popular with the people of Russia. But perhaps Ivan's greatest achievements in these early years were on the battlefield. He led his armies to victory against the Kates of Kazan and Astrakhan, taking over large areas of land along the Volga River and expanding Russia's borders to the Caspian Sea. These victories were celebrated throughout the land, and Ivan was praised as a hero, a conquering leader who had brought glory to Russia. But even as Ivan enjoyed his success, there were also problems. In 1553, Ivan fell seriously ill, and the court was once again in chaos as different groups competed for power, waiting for the Tsar to die. Ivan recovered, but his near-death experience seems to have deeply affected him. He started to distrust the people around him and saw threats and conspiracies everywhere. These fears were made worse by the sudden death of his beloved wife, Anastasia, in 1560. Ivan was sure that his enemies had poisoned her, especially the boyars he had always mistrusted. Ivan was so sad and worried that he started to rule in a cruel and violent way. He was aggressive towards people he thought were a threat, whether he actually was or not. Boyars were arrested, tortured and killed for the smallest reason. Ivan was so angry that he even destroyed entire cities. In 1570, he attacked and destroyed the city of Novgorod. He was sure that the people who lived there were planning to attack him. Many people were killed in a cruel attack by the Tsar. Perhaps the most worrying sign of Ivan's move towards tyranny was the creation of the oprichniki, his secret police force. The oprichniki were scary because they wore black and rode black horses. They showed that the evil ruler, the Tsar, was very powerful. They only answered to Ivan, doing whatever he said, quickly and without question. The oprichniki ruled Russia with an iron fist, and the country descended into a reign of terror. Boyars were hunted down and killed, and their estates were taken from them and given to Ivan's friends. Even the church was at risk. Ivan had the Metropolitan of Moscow, Philip II, arrested and eventually killed for criticizing the oprichniki excesses. As Ivan's paranoia and cruelty got worse, Russia itself started to fall apart. The economy was already struggling because of Ivan's expensive wars, and it got even worse because of the oprichniki. Fields were left untended as peasants ran away from the countryside to escape the secret police's brutality. There was a lot of hunger and many people died, and the land was very sad. But perhaps the worst moment of Ivan's rule was a very sad event that happened to him. In 1581, during a fierce argument, Ivan hit his son and heir, also named Ivan, with a pointed stick, hurting the young man very badly on the head. Ivan Ivanovich died a few days later, leaving the Tsar very sad and feeling bad about what had happened. It's a sad and memorable moment. The mighty Tsar was crying over the dead body of his son. At that moment, it's almost possible to see the weight of all of Ivan's cruel and paranoid actions coming down on him, and to understand that he had become a monster. The death of his son seemed to break something in Ivan. In his final years, he spent a lot of time in prayer and thinking. But even as his body got weaker, his mind stayed as clear and paranoid as ever. He carried on lashing out at the people around him, thinking that they were all being unfaithful to him. Ivan the Terrible died in 1584 while playing chess. According to the story, he had just moved his king to the square where it would be captured, as if he knew he was going to lose. It was a fitting end for a man whose life had been defined by a ruthless struggle for power. Ivan's legacy is complicated and violent. He was a man of contradictions, capable of great cruelty and great kindness, of brutal violence and deep remorse. He made Russia bigger and made the government stronger, but it cost a lot of people their lives. He was feared by his enemies and respected by the people he ruled. He had a big impact on Russian history. We are sad when we think about Ivan's story. He had everything going for him: power, money, intelligence. But he destroyed his own life with his paranoia and cruelty. His life is a warning about the dangers of having too much power and how fear and suspicion can destroy people. But there might also be something to learn from Ivan's story. Even though Ivan had his flaws, he was a man who thought a lot about the things he had done wrong. In his final years, he realized how bad his sins were and tried to make up for them by praying and saying sorry. It shows that even the worst people can still have some human kindness inside them. Remember that power can be a heavy burden to bear, even if it can be tempting. It can break a person's spirit if they don't have wisdom, compassion, and humility to balance it. We should remember Ivan the Terrible not just as a tyrant or a madman, but as a deeply flawed and complex human being. His story still teaches us a lot about the dangers and responsibilities of power. As we go to sleep, let's not think about the terrible things Ivan did. Instead, let's dream of a world where we have learned from his life and where the good in us can overcome the bad. As we have seen, there were many kings in medieval times who were mentally ill cruel, and bad at their jobs. These kings and queens were not always well liked. They ruled in countries like France, England, Sweden, and Russia. They had a big effect on their countries and on history. But mental illness was not the only problem that medieval kings had. Ruling in the Middle Ages was very difficult, even for the most stable and capable of monarchs. The complicated system of obligations between nobles, the constant threat of war and invasion, and the intrigues and power struggles in court life. All of these pressures put a lot of pressure on King. Henry V, the sixth King of England, is a good example of a king who had to deal with these challenges. Henry was born into the Lancastrian dynasty during the 100 Years' War with France. He became king as a baby when his father, the great warrior King Henry V, died suddenly of dysentery in 1422. Henry was too young to rule on his own, so other nobles had to share power with him. His uncle John, the Duke of Bedford, was managing the war in France. Another uncle, Humphrey, the Duke of Gloucester, was trying to increase his power at home as Lord Protector. As he grew up, Henry became a kind and religious ruler. He was more interested in religion and learning than in war. He was a kind supporter of the church and started two very famous schools, Eton College and King's College, Cambridge. People who knew him at the time said he was a tall, handsome man, but he did not like violence and preferred a simple life. But being king required more than just being religious and having good intentions. The royal treasury was empty. England was losing its power in France, and powerful noble groups like the houses of York and Somerset were fighting more and more. This all needed strong leadership, which the kind but useless Henry did not have. These things made Henry's already fragile mental state even weaker. I often feel sad. In the summer of 1453, he went mad. Some people say this was because he was very shocked when he lost most of his father's French conquests. The king, who was once full of life, fell into a deep, silent state, not responding at all to the world around him. The king's sleeping sickness, as it was known, left the kingdom in a state of uncertainty. People tried really hard to get Henry to wake up, but he didn't react, couldn't speak, and seemed not to recognize anyone, even his own wife and baby son. He was given food, and he didn't even react when he was offered a special document that could have saved the life of a nobleman in prison. For over a year, as the king lay in a coma, a dangerous situation grew worse. This was happening at the same time as the king was away and the kingdom was in danger. It was in this situation that one of the most important events in English history took place. This was the start of the Wars of the Roses. With Henry unable to do anything, the ambitious Richard, Duke of York, took action. He persuaded Parliament to name him as protector and heir, which meant that Henry's son, Prince Edward, would not inherit anything. But York would face strong opposition from Henry's clever and determined wife, Queen Margaret of Anjou. Margaret was determined to protect her son's birthright. She rallied the Lancastrian forces, turning a dynastic rivalry into an all-out civil war. For the next 30 years, England was split as the houses of York and Lancaster fought for power. But even so, the poor Henry was still a pawn. He was sometimes calm and in control, but sometimes he would lose himself in his own thoughts. He briefly returned to the throne in 1470, but was deposed and imprisoned again by the Yorkist King Edward IV. Henry died alone in the Tower of London on the night of May 21st, 1471. The king, who was once loved and kind, died a lonely and shameful death. Henry was murdered. Some people say it was on Edward's orders. His tragic reign is a sad reminder of the huge pressures and challenges that medieval kings faced. He was suddenly king when he was very young. His father was a warrior, and he had to follow in his footsteps. But he had a lot of pressure to do well, and there were problems inside and outside the country. It's perhaps little wonder that he struggled to keep going. But Henry's story also shows that the idea of kingship is still attractive. Even though it was dangerous and difficult, being king was still the most important job. Rival families and noblemen who wanted to be king fought for it. Being king meant having a lot of power and being able to decide the future of a nation. It meant being at the center of the medieval world where everyone was watching. As we'll see with our next king, having so much power and attention could be just as harmful to a king's mental health as any outside threat. Eric XIV of Sweden was a prince during the Renaissance who was known for being very intelligent and having a lot of culture. However, his wonderful reign would soon come to an end because of a crazy storm. There's been a scandal. There's blood. Eric's story starts on a nice sunny day in June 1560. The 27-year-old prince rode through the streets of Stockholm to UPS Cathedral for his long-awaited coronation. The first king of the Vasa dynasty to be crowned king of Sweden and the Goths. Eric was determined to make his kingdom better than it had ever been before. He is tall, sporty, and very handsome, with blue eyes and a long curly beard. Eric looked very handsome. He was charming and could speak 8 languages. He wrote poetry, played the lute, and was a keen astronomy and mathematics scholar. He was the perfect example of a Renaissance prince. He was well-educated, intelligent, and talented. But even on that special coronation day, there were signs of the problems that would happen during Eric's reign. People were surprised that he insisted on riding a white stallion. This is because in traditional beliefs, riding a white stallion was a privilege reserved for the day of Christ's second coming. The extravagant celebrations, which included 3 days and nights of constant eating, drinking, and dancing, seemed to some people to be almost too much. As he settled into his role as king, Eric's behavior became more and more strange. He thought that everyone around him, even his own family, was plotting against him. He would get very angry very easily and hit both courtiers and servants. There were rumors that he took part in strange occult rituals and was under the influence of a sinister Italian mystic named Carolo. But people were really talking about Eric's love life, which was quite scandalous. Eric turned down the kind suggestions of his council and fell in love with a beautiful commoner named Karen Mons' daughter. Karen was the daughter of a prison guard. She had been brought to the court as a maid of honor, but she quickly caught the king's eye. His advisors were horrified when he secretly married Karen in 1567, making the commoner his queen. It was an act of defiance that went against all royal rules and made things worse between Eric and the Swedish nobility. Karen was shy and very loyal to her husband, who was often moody. This made her the target of cruel gossip. As Eric's paranoia and instability grew, so too did the conflicts with the people he was competing against and being criticized by. He thought the powerful Stura family was planning to overthrow him, so he decided to attack first. On that important day in May 1567, Eric invited several important people from Stura to a big meal at UPS Castle, including the very friendly Niels Svanesen Stura. This is what happened next. It is known as the Steyr murders. This was a shocking act of violence against the royal family that made Eric's reign very difficult. The script continues in a similar way, telling the story in a way that is easy to understand, and it shows how Eric's mental health is getting worse. The Stura murders and what happened afterwards, his forced abdication and sad final years in prison with Karen, as planned. Then it moves on to the exciting story of Ivan the Terrible. He talks about all the important things from his difficult childhood, like his early wins, the tough Oprychniki, and the sad death of his son. The script looks at other stories about crazy kings in the past, as we said before. It ends with a deep thought about the huge pressures of being a king in the Middle Ages and what these difficult times teach us about power, mental health, and what it's like to be human in that time. The music is soothing and perfect for playing to help people fall asleep. The cruelty and chaos of Ivan the Terrible's final years left Russia in a difficult position. The kingdom, which had started off well, was now in chaos. As the 16th century was ending, the question was still being asked: who would lead Russia in the future? When Ivan died in 1584, things were in a state of flux. His son Theodore inherited the throne, but he was a weak and ineffectual ruler. The real power was in the hands of advisors like Boris Godunov, whose political maneuvering would soon win him the crown. Russia was under threat from Poland, Sweden, and Crimean Tatars, as well as problems in its own country. It's perhaps no wonder that some people looked back at Ivan's rule with nostalgia, remembering his early victories and reforms rather than the bloody purges of his later years. He was a big influence on future Russian rulers, who either shunned or embraced his ideas about how to govern the huge country. Ivan the Terrible was a complicated man. He made Russia bigger, made Tsar more powerful, and made a lasting impact on his nation's history and culture. But he also used his power to cause a lot of harm, and he became very suspicious and desperate. His story shows the good and bad points of absolute monarchy. But Ivan wasn't the only medieval ruler whose time and power was ruined by madness. Across Europe, kings had to deal with the huge pressures of ruling, and this often had a very bad effect on their personal lives and the lives of the people they ruled. Take the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, for example. He ruled from 1576 to 1612. He was a big supporter of the arts and sciences, but he was also known for being strange and not wanting to socialize. He filled his court with astrologers, alchemists, and other unusual people, including the famous Golem of Prague. But behind the quirkiness was a lot of sadness. Rudolf often felt very sad and depressed. He became very paranoid and refused to leave his bed for days. He only spoke to his advisors by putting notes through a slot in his door. He didn't take care of running his empire, which led to politics being stuck and people being unhappy. Perhaps most famously, Rudolf developed the delusion that he was made of glass and could shatter at any moment. He started wearing lots of thick clothes to protect himself and wouldn't let anyone touch him. His family became so worried about his behavior that they plotted to remove him from power. They forced Rudolf to give the throne to his brother, Matthias. Rudolf spent his final years as a recluse in Prague Castle. He was surrounded by his art and curiosities, but isolated from the world he once ruled. When he died in 1612, he reportedly refused to be given the last rites, still gripped by his delusions until the very end. The stories of Rudolf and Ivan are very sad and make us think about what it is like to have a lot of power. Were these kings just not prepared for the huge pressure and responsibility of ruling? Could having absolute monarchy without any checks and balances have led to paranoia and instability? Or were they like canaries in a coal mine? Their declining mental health is a result of the harmful and broken society they were born into. Even so, their problems had very big effects on their own lives and the lives of the people they were in charge of. Across the Mediterranean, the Byzantine Empire was also being ruled by a leader who was delusional. Justin II was a promising leader when he started out. He ruled from 565 to 578. He made sure the empire's eastern border was secure by negotiating with Persia and started some big building projects. But a few years later, Justin's behavior became strange. He was sure that he couldn't sit down. He would lie on a wheeled throne that could be pushed around the palace. He's been known to bite people who he doesn't like and even try to eat one of his own limbs. As Justin became more and more crazy, the empire started to fall apart. The Persians invaded Byzantine territory. The Avars and Slavs attacked from the west, and Italy fell into chaos as the Lombards swept through. Justin couldn't stop it. He was lost in a world of his own imagination. In a sad twist of fate, one of the few people who seemed able to calm Justin down during his tantrums was his wife, Sophia. Sophia was a very clever person who was good at politics. She was so popular that she basically ruled the country herself. She even had her own picture on the coins. She kept the empire together until Justin died in 578. The stories of kings like Ivan, Rudolf, and Justin show how a ruler's mental state can have a big effect on their kingdom. In a time when there was only one king, the line between personal struggle and political crisis was very thin. But even when they are at their worst, there are still moments that show they are human and make them more than just stories to be warned about. Ivan is sad because his son has died. Rudolf is sad but very clever. Justin is sad, but sometimes he is not sad when he is with Sophia. These details make their lives more complicated and sad. One of the best examples of this is the story of Charles II, the last Habsburg ruler of Spain. Charles was born in 1661 and was the result of many years of the Spanish Habsburgs marrying each other to keep their family line pure. The results were really bad. Charles had many health problems. He had a big tongue which made it hard to speak or eat. He also had problems with his stomach which caused him to have diarrhea all the time. His bones were weak and he could not walk without help. His jaw stuck out so far that he couldn't close his mouth properly. Charles may not have been the most physically or mentally strong person, but he was very kind and friendly. He was a kind person who enjoyed simple things like playing with his collection of pocket watches. His time as king was marked by decline and disorder, but he was still popular with his subjects because he was generous. When Charles died without having any children in 1700, this made Europe very worried because different countries were fighting to be the new king of Spain. This was called the War of the Spanish Succession. His personal struggles reflected the struggles of the whole continent. This was a sad reflection of the uncertain political balance of the time. These stories from the medieval world might seem very different to our modern lives. The time of absolute monarchy is long gone. Now we have democratic institutions and constitutional safeguards. In the past, mental illness was seen as being caused by evil spirits or as a punishment from God. Now, we know that it is a medical condition that needs to be treated and supported. But even though these kings had it tough, we can still learn from their stories. The pressure to meet other people's expectations, feeling alone in leadership, and wanting to have a purpose and legacy. These are universal human experiences that are not affected by time or background. In the end, the best way to honor people like Ivan, Rudolf, Justin, and Charles is to remember them as more than just villains or warnings. We should remember them as complex human beings who were dealing with the weight of their roles and the limits of their own minds. No matter how hard they try, people will always have their struggles. This shows that people are fragile and strong at the same time. So, as we drift off to sleep, let's think about these kings from long ago. Their sad lives are written in history books. Their stories teach us about the strong effect that power and mental health can have on people and countries. We should also face our own challenges in the same way that we want others to face their challenges. Good night and sweet dreams. The dark, gloomy cells of his prison allowed his health to get worse. His eyes, which used to be bright and lively, had lost their shine, and he would stare at the shadows on the wall for hours. His world had become just a small, flickering flame. The fire in his mind was slowly dying out. After almost 10 years as a prisoner, Eric XI, the crazy king of Sweden, died in 1577. His wife Karen was with him until the end, holding his hand as he died. The king, who had dreamed of being great and powerful, died a broken man. His big dreams were crushed by his own mental health problems. The sadness of Eric XIV's rule is still felt today. a story to warn you about how easily the human mind can be damaged. His story teaches us that even the strongest can fail. They were so weak because they had inner demons. In the end, Eric's legacy was that he had a lot of potential but didn't use it. A shooting star that was too short-lived, extinguished by the darkness within. As we carry on exploring stories about crazy kings and their difficult rule, we look to the huge, harsh Russian land. Here we find another king who was cruel and paranoid, a ruler who took the name Ivan the Terrible and truly deserved it. Ivan Ivanovich Vassilevich was born in 1530 to the royal Rurik dynasty, a family that had ruled Russia for centuries. Sadly, he had a difficult and unstable early life. When Ivan was only 3, his father died. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, took care of him. But Elena's ruler's regent was killed by poison in 1538, leaving the young Ivan an orphan at the age of 8. Ivan was robbed of his parents, and his childhood was full of fighting for power. The Boyars, Russia's most noble family, were fighting to take control of the young prince. They were trying to fill the gap left by the death of his mother. In this world of people full of ambition, Ivan was neglected, ignored, and even mistreated by the people who were supposed to protect him. The seeds of bitterness and mistrust were planted early, and loneliness and fear made them grow. But even in his darkest moments, there were times when he showed the fierce intelligence that would define Ivan's later reign. He found comfort in the Orthodox faith, spending time praying and reading religious texts. He also discovered that he was good at politics, watching the boys' behavior closely and thinking carefully about what it meant. As Ivan grew up, he started to show that he wanted to make his own decisions rather than having others tell him what to do. In 1547, Ivan was just 16 when he was made the supreme ruler of all Russia. His coronation marked a turning point, the moment when the neglected child became a king in truth as well as name. The early years of Ivan's reign were marked by a lot of changes and battles. He updated Russia's laws, limiting the power of the boyars and giving more authority to the Tsar. He also made Russia bigger by fighting and winning wars against the nearby areas of Kazan and Astrakhan. These victories made Ivan very popular with his subjects. The young Tsar was seen as a strong leader who was ready to take bold action to make Russia stronger. But even as Ivan felt happy about his success, there were also some problems. The bad things that happened to Ivan when he was a child had made him very unhappy. He often felt paranoid and suspicious, thinking there were enemies everywhere. He was known for his bad temper, which would get him angry very easily. As his power grew, he also became more cruel. He was angry with the boys who had bullied him when he was younger. In 1565, Ivan's growing paranoia led him to become a tyrant. He split Russia into 2 parts. The Zakina was ruled by the boyars, while the Opratina was under Ivan's direct control. The Opratukina was a place within a place of fear and cruelty. It was controlled by Ivan's feared Oprichniki, his loyal band of secret police. Dressed in black and riding black horses, the Oprichniki became a symbol of Ivan's cruel rule. They walked around the land, stopping and killing anyone they thought was not loyal to the Tsar. Even important people like nobles, merchants, and priests were killed because of Ivan's cruel behavior. Ivan ordered them to be tortured and killed. The Tsar himself was not immune to the madness he had unleashed. He got so angry in 1581 that he hit his pregnant daughter-in-law, which caused her to lose the baby. When his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, confronted him about this cruelty, the Tsar lashed out, striking his son with his scepter. The blow was the last straw, and Ivan Ivanovich died a few days later, leaving Russia without an heir. The tragedy made Ivan feel very sad. His last bit of sanity was gone because of how guilty and sad he felt. In his final years, the Tsar became more and more crazy, and he became more and more cruel. He ordered the massacre of entire cities, their inhabitants slaughtered by the thousands. He had boyars boiled alive or frozen to death, enjoying their suffering. When he died in 1584, Russia was a land full of fear, haunted by the memory of its crazy king. Ivan the Terrible was a very cruel and paranoid ruler. His reign is still remembered in Russian history, but it also reminds us of the terrible things that can happen when a person's thoughts are full of darkness. This is a story that shows the dangers of giving someone too much power. As we get to the end of our journey through the history of crazy kings and bad reigns, it's worth stopping to think about the things that link these stories together. No matter what country we're talking about, whether it's England, Sweden, or Russia, we see the same pattern happening again and again. The harmful effects of having power on the mind. For these kings and queens, the weight of the crown was too much. The isolation and stress of rule are having a negative effect on their minds and souls. Some rulers, like Charles V of France and Henry V of England, were unable to cope with the pressure. They were no longer sane. Others, like Ivan the Terrible, turned their inner demons outward, making their servants suffer and feeling paranoid. Each time, the crazy actions of the king had very bad results, causing chaos and fighting in their countries. Wars were fought, lives were lost, and the course of history was changed forever by the actions of someone who was not thinking clearly. But the saddest thing about these stories is the effect they have on people. The impact was felt not only by the kings themselves, but also by their closest associates. Karen Mornt's daughter is a loyal wife. She stood by her husband even when he was going through a difficult time. The children liked Ivan Ivanovich, whose life was cut short by his father's madness. Many people suffered under the rule of a crazy king. These stories of crazy kings show how easily people can be fooled and how bad power can be. They remind us that even the strongest can be defeated, their power taken over by the darkness inside. As we say goodbye to these ghostly figures of history, let's think about their stories with kindness and sadness. They're sad and shows our own human weaknesses. It shows the bad side of us that is waiting to be brought out. Their stories should be a warning to us. They should encourage us to be compassionate and understanding, even when we are faced with cruelty and madness. We should all try to be sensible and not let our lives get out of control. And so, dear listeners, we have reached the end of our journey through the realms of mad kings and tragic fates. We have explored the darkest moments in history, looking closely at the struggles of kings and queens who were haunted by their own personal issues. From the beautiful palaces of France to the wild plains of Russia, we have seen the damage caused by a troubled mind on the throne. We have seen the harm that comes from a person who is not mentally well. But we shouldn't leave this journey feeling sad. Even in the worst situations, there are always moments of good. The wives and children who showed great love and loyalty, even when things seemed crazy. Even small acts of kindness and compassion can break through the walls of paranoia and fear. These two lessons are what history tells us. The old stories tell us to be our best selves. The stories of these crazy kings show us our own weaknesses. It's like looking at both the dark and the light. Can we be wise and learn from their mistakes? Can we be brave and face our own problems? So goodbye to Charles the Mad, Henry the Helpless, Eric and Ivan, and all the other troubled figures of history. Let us remember their stories like we remember old photographs. These stories remind us of the good and bad parts of being human. As we drift off to sleep, let's remember that even in the worst situations, there is always hope. Good night, dear listeners, and sweet dreams. I hope you have nice dreams of nice times and nice kings. I hope you wake up in a world where the bad things that happened in the past are just things that people remember, and a new day is coming. As we have seen, the behavior of medieval kings was often defined by their personalities and personal struggles as much as by their political actions. The huge pressure and responsibility of ruling, as well as the constant plots and power struggles in court, could be very difficult for anyone. For people who are already mentally unwell or have a history of mental health issues, the pressure could be too much. This could lead to strange, destructive, and sometimes tyrannical behavior. The story of Ivan the Terrible is a good example of how a king's personal problems can have a big effect on his country. Ivan was born at a time of big changes and violence. This made him a ruler that people were both scared of and respected. As a young man, he was known for his intelligence, curiosity, and military skill. He expanded Russia's territories and introduced popular reforms. But as time went on, he became more and more paranoid and cruel. This was because he was obsessed with power and afraid of betrayal. The Opretniki were Ivan's secret police and a dark turning point in his reign. These agents, who were wearing black, were given free rein to terrorize the population, taking people's property, torturing and killing those they suspected of disloyalty. They became a symbol of Ivan's increasingly strange and cruel rule, causing chaos and fear throughout the land. The most tragic event in Ivan's life was the death of his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich. In a rage during an argument, Ivan hit his pregnant daughter-in-law, which caused her to lose the baby. When his son confronted him about this, Ivan lashed out again, hitting the young man's head with his scepter, killing him. This awful thing that happened made Ivan feel very guilty and sad, and it made his final years feel dark. As Ivan's health got worse and he became more unwell, Russia fell into a state of chaos and disorder. Attacks from other countries increased as the country's defenses got weaker, and there was a lot of fighting and disagreement inside the country. Ivan was so paranoid that he suspected everyone of plotting against him. He was lashing out with increasing brutality and repression. In the end, Ivan died in a state of chaos and conflict, just as he had lived. Legend has it that he was playing chess when he suddenly became very sick. He fell to the floor in pain. Some people say it was poison that finally killed him. They think one of his many enemies put poison in his drink. Others think it was just the result of a very difficult life. Ivan's legacy is difficult to understand. It is full of bloodshed and fear, but there were also some good things and important changes. He is still an important part of Russian history, and people have strong feelings about him. He was cruel and crazy, but there's a sad story behind him too. It feels like a waste of potential and the high cost of unchecked power. When we think about the lives of these kings, who had such a difficult time, we can't help but feel sorry for them, as well as feel shocked at the things they did. The weight of the crown could be a heavy burden, even for the strongest of minds. In a time when absolute power was the norm and the line between ruler and tyrant was thin, it's perhaps no surprise that so many kings give in to their worst impulses and darkest fears. But even in the worst situations, there are still good people. Even as Eric XIV lost his sanity, his loyal wife, Karen Mo, stayed by his side. Ivan the Terrible was crying over his dead son. The short moments of clarity and kindness that appear in the middle of chaos. Even the most infamous people in history were still human at their core. As we finish our look at some of the most infamous kings in medieval history, we realize that their legacies were complicated and had many aspects. They were products of their time and circumstances. These circumstances were shaped by the unique pressures and expectations of their roles. Their stories teach us important lessons. They show us that power can corrupt people and that it is easy to make bad decisions. They also show us that many people are fascinated by the people who shape history. In the big picture of what people go through in life, these crazy kings are just a few brightly colored threads. Their bright colors have faded over time, but they still have a certain dark charm. As we drift off to sleep, we are full of thoughts about them. Stories of great success and failure, of happiness and sadness, of being very powerful and feeling very sad. They may have been the worst of kings, but even though they had flaws and made mistakes, they were also human. Maybe that's what makes their stories so interesting and hard to forget, even as we fall asleep. Good night, dear listener. I hope your dreams are full of the simple joys and comforts of a peaceful life. In the end, that may be the most important thing of all. We should be remembered for the small kindnesses we do every day, which make the world a better place. So relax now and let the past become a memory as we enjoy the present and all its possibilities. The fourth part is about Ivan the Terrible of Russia. We are leaving behind the troubled stories of Charles the Mad, Henry V, and Eric I. Our journey through medieval history takes us to 16th century Russia. Here we find a ruler whose nickname says it all. Ivan the Terrible, the first Tsar of Russia, Ivan Ivanovich Vassilevich, was a cruel and powerful ruler. Ivan's story, like many others we've explored, starts with a difficult childhood. Ivan was born in 1530. He was only 3 years old when his father died. This left him Grand Prince of Moscow. His mother was in charge of him while he was young. But even this small stability was soon shattered. When Ivan was 8, his mother also died, probably from poisoning. The young prince was now completely alone, surrounded by cruel nobles and Russian boyars who were all fighting for power. You can almost picture the quiet, cautious boy, his eyes darting wearily around the shadowy halls of the Kremlin. He heard people whispering about conspiracies, both real and imagined. These early years made Ivan feel very distrustful and angry, and this made him cruel. But Ivan's early reign gave little sign of the terror to come. At only 16, the young ruler was crowned Tsar. He worked closely with his wife, Anastasia Romanovna, and his trusted advisor, Alexei Disev, to make a lot of important changes to the country. He updated the law code, met with the first Russian parliament, and gave the gentry more rights. He was also victorious on the battlefield, conquering the Kazan city and expanding Russia's territory. For a moment, it seemed Russia had found a true Renaissance man in its Tsar. Ivan loved art and architecture, and he had the famous St. Basil's Cathedral built. It has colorful swirly designs and onion domes. He was an author and composer, and he made his court a place full of music and literature. But beneath this bright surface, a darkness was starting to take hold. The death of his beloved Anastasia in 1560 seemed to change Ivan a lot. He thought that his enemies had poisoned him, and his paranoia got so bad that he went mad. He was angry with the people around him, kicking out Adish and attacking the boyars he had always hated. In a very scary start to the horror, even one of his biggest critics, Prince Andrei Kbsky, was tortured and beheaded in the Red Square. This was the start of a very difficult time for Ivan, which led to him being given a nickname. In 1565, Ivan created the Oprynina, a part of the country that was basically his own private territory. The Opryniki, Ivan's secret police, were at the head of the organization. They were fanatically loyal and completely ruthless. Dressed all in black and riding black horses, they looked terrifying as they walked through the land, coming down on towns like a group of crows. No one was safe from their anger. The Orekniki killed many of Boyar's religious leaders and even whole cities. In the city of Novgorod, which was once a busy trading center, thousands of people were tortured and killed on Ivan's orders, and their blood turned the folk off river red. It said Ivan would watch the massacres with glee, his eyes shining with a terrible frenzy. But even in the middle of all this chaos, there were times when he was surprisingly clear-headed and felt regret. In 1581, Ivan got so angry that he hit his pregnant daughter-in-law for wearing clothes that he thought were too sexy. This made her lose the baby. When his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, confronted him, the older Ivan got very angry and hit his son with a scepter. The blow was the last straw. As Ivan held his dying son, he seemed to become sane again for a short time. He cried and asked for forgiveness, but it was too late. With his heir dead and his kingdom in turmoil, Ivan was overcome with despair. He died in 1584, lonely and a little crazy, while he was playing a game of chess. Ivan the Terrible is remembered for the many lives he took. His time in power started off well, but then he became a warning example of how it is not good to have too much power and not use it in a good way. The Tsar, who people had once praised for trying to make changes and for being an important part of Russian culture, was now seen as a bad leader. But there might be a sad part to Ivan's story, too. A boy who was taken away from his childhood, full of paranoia and suspicion, who turned into the monster he was scared of. Near the Kremlin, you can almost hear the echoes of his troubled mind. This is a scary reminder of how cruel kings can be. As we let Ivan's story fade into the past, we turn our attention to other strange kings and queens, each with their own strange story. From the shy Rudolf II to the unlucky Charles II of Spain, these kings make the story of medieval madness even more interesting. But that's a story for another time. For now, let the ghost of Ivan the Terrible haunt your dreams. A figure that is half hidden in shadow and mystery, forever written into the history of Russia's turbulent past. As you drift off to sleep, think about the thin line between being great and being crazy, and the huge cost of having all the power. Good night, dear listener, and may your dreams be gentler than the memories of Ivan's reign. In the fifth part, we'll look at other crazy kings and queens. As the memory of Ivan the Terrible disappears into the past, we find ourselves drifting in the mists of history. Our journey is not yet complete. The annals of the Middle Ages are full of stories about kings who were different from the others. Some ruled from the shadows, their strange abilities talked about only in whispers. Others wore their strange features on their clothes, leaving a mark that was as impossible to forget as it was weird. Let's start by looking at the court of Rudolf II, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Bohemia, Hungary, and Croatia. Rudolf was born in 1552. He had unusual interests. He was more interested in beer and books about alchemy than in politics. He really liked art and science and employed many scholars, artists, and astronomers to work for him, including the famous Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe. But even as Rudolf became more learned, he started to feel strange. The king thought he was made of glass, fragile, and easily broken. He refused to let people touch him, and even started wearing thick padded clothing to protect his delicate body. You can almost picture him moving carefully through his rooms. A phantom king that was as insubstantial as the spirits he tried to conjure in his alchemical experiments. Rudolf's interest in the supernatural and his increasingly withdrawn behavior were starting to have a negative effect on his kingdom. He didn't take care of the country's business, which led to rising tensions and a lack of money. In the end, even his own family turned against him. In 1611, Rudolf's brother, Matthias, overthrew him. The great patron of the arts was left to live out his final months alone, haunted by his own thoughts. In the middle of the Byzantine Empire, another ruler has gone mad. Justin II was the ruler from 565 to 578. He started his rule with energy and ambition. But as time went on, his behavior became more and more strange. He often laughed uncontrollably and got very angry for no reason. He imagined himself talking directly to the angel Gabriel and would often be found deep in conversation with the empty air. As Justin's delusions grew stronger, his wife, Empress Sophia, took charge of running the country. But even her steady hand could not stop the chaos caused by Justin's madness. The empire's enemies, seeing a chance, attacked from all sides. When Justin finally gave in to his problems and left the throne, it was ready for years of trouble and getting worse. But perhaps no king better shows what happens when a royal family gets too big and starts to mix with their own kind than Charles II of Spain. Charles was born in 1661 and was the result of many years of Habsburg marriages. A family more complicated than a group of bushes. His tongue was so big it was hard for him to speak. His jaw stuck out so far that he had difficulty chewing his food. But he had a serious mental disability that made him unfit to be king. Charles was the last of the Spanish Empire. Charles was unable to have children, so when he died, his kingdom was divided up by his neighbors. He was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. He was a king that people either admired or disliked. This is a sad end for a family that was once very successful, and many people in Europe wanted to be like them. And so our journey through the gallery of mad monarchs comes to a close. From the crazy ideas of Rudolf II to the sad stories of Charles II, these kings show us the strange things that can happen when power and problems mix. Their stories show how, sometimes, being great and being crazy are very close together. They also show how the crown can have a big effect on even the most prepared of minds. But as we let these stories drift into the world of dreams, let's also remember the people behind the history. These are not just kings, but men. Men feel the weight of the world on their shoulders. Men were dealing with personal issues. In the dim light of the past, their shadows seem bigger, but their sadnesses are also a result of the passing of time. And so, dear listener, as you drift off to sleep, let these stories remind you of how tricky power can be and how easily the human mind can be fooled. May you drift off to the memories of the past, safe in the knowledge that even though these kings had their flaws, they were still as real as the air you breathe and your dreams. Good night, and may the lessons of history help you drift off to sleep. This is the end of the text. As the last sounds of our journey through medieval madness fade into the quiet of the night, we find ourselves back in the present. Our minds are full of the strange characters and tales we've encountered. From Ivan the Terrible's troubled mind to Rudolf II's delusions, these kings and queens show us how mental illness can affect people and even change the course of a nation's history and the world. In the shadowy past, it's easy to judge these troubled rulers. We might see them as weak or tyrannical, unfit to rule. But to do that would be to ignore the very real struggles they faced, both in their own minds and in the difficult world of court life. These men were born into power, but they also had to deal with constant danger. Even the smallest mistake could be used against them by other people who wanted to get ahead. Some rulers, like Charles the Mad and Henry V, found that being king was too much for them. They lost touch with reality. For others, like Eric XIV and Ivan the Terrible, madness and cruelty went hand in hand, and their reigns were marked by bloodshed and terror. And some people, like Rudolf II and Charles II, went into their own private worlds. Weird shadows on the edge of power. But there's one thing they all have in common. The crown can have a big effect on the mind of anyone who wears it. In a time when kings were seen as chosen by God, the difference between a king and a normal person was often unclear. Being a ruler meant being chosen to lead, and with that came great responsibility and the eyes of the world on you. Is it any wonder that some people couldn't cope? But even with their flaws, these kings had a huge impact on history. They ruled for different lengths of time, and some were good while others were bad. They had a big effect on the history of their countries and the lives of many people. In the long history of the world, they are just a small part of a much bigger story. But their stories are still there, part of the rich and complex history of the Middle Ages. As we let these stories settle into the back of our minds, ready to resurface in our dreams, let us think about what we can learn from them in our own age of power and ambition. The problems of these kings who died a long time ago may seem far away, but they show us important ideas about what it's like to be human, how easily our minds can be affected, and how power can change people for the worse. The most important lesson is to be kind. Even the most powerful people are human at heart. They have feelings just like anyone else. It reminds us to be careful with power and to remember that those in charge are as worthy of understanding and kindness as anyone else. And so, dear listener, as you drift off to sleep, let the stories of these troubled kings remind you of how complicated life can be, with all its sadness and strange beauty. I hope you see in their stories something to be learned, and also a sign of the human connection that links us all, no matter what time period or situation we are in. Good night, and I hope you wait for a kinder and wiser world on the journey through history that we've shared. This is the next part of the script for the worst kings in medieval history. It is boring history that will make you fall asleep. As Ivan entered the final years of his reign, his physical and mental health continued to get worse. The ruler, who was once strong and in charge, was increasingly ill, in pain, and unable to control himself. The effects of many years of difficult rule and personal problems have been very bad. Ivan was spending more and more time alone in his private rooms, thinking about things and sometimes being mean to the people around him. He had a lot of doubts and was getting very annoyed with his advisors and boyars. Bizarre saw enemies and conspiracies everywhere, and his paranoia was getting worse. Sadly, even his own family was not spared from his growing madness and cruelty. In 1581, he had a very sad experience that would bother him for the rest of his life. The story goes that the Tsar went into his daughter-in-law Helen's room, who was pregnant, to find her wearing clothes that he thought were too revealing. Ivan was so angry that he hit the young woman very badly. This made the woman lose her baby. Ivan's son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, learned about the attack. The Tsarevich hurried to speak to his father. He wanted to know how he could do such a terrible thing. A violent argument broke out between a father and son, with both men getting very angry and shouting at each other. Ivan hit his son on the head with his scepter, which was a heavy, pointed staff. The blow was so violent that the Tsar died from it. Ivan Ivanovich passed out and died a few days later from blood loss to the head. The tragedy made Ivan feel very sad, and many people in Russia also felt very sad. Ivan felt guilty and regretful after what happened, and his health and sanity quickly got worse. He was heard crying and hitting his head against walls, asking for forgiveness. The once strong Tsar became very sad and couldn't rule his land. Ivan had no other choice but to name his younger, developmentally disabled son, Feyer, as the next Tsar because he did not have a favored heir. A few years later, Ivan was on his deathbed. He must have been sad thinking about the chaos and uncertainty that would follow him. He could only hope that his surviving sons and boyars would find a way to keep the kingdom united. According to a popular story, Ivan's death finally came while he was playing a game of chess with one of his advisors. The Tsar was thinking about what he should do next when he had a stroke and fell down. As people tried to help him, Ivan slipped into a coma and died soon after. It was a very boring end to the eventful life of one of Russia's most famous rulers. Even Ivan the Terrible was buried in the Archangel Cathedral with his ancestors. The controversial ruler left behind a complicated legacy. He was a man who could be cruel and violent, but he also wanted to make Russia stronger. He made it bigger, introduced changes, and prepared the way for a royal family that would rule for hundreds of years. But Ivan was also responsible for a time of great suffering for his people. Many people were killed, tortured, and sent away while he was in charge. The secret police in Oprichnina caused chaos and fear. Many of the Tsar's closest advisors and family members were killed by him. It's easy to picture the scary and uncertain feeling that spread through the kingdom. After he died, his successors fought each other for power. Foreign countries invaded Russia. There were also periods of famine and civil unrest. These were called the time of troubles. It would be decades before the country was stable again under the Romanovs. But the memory of Ivan the Terrible was still very important to the Russians. He was a symbol of the dangers of having complete power. We think about the time when Ivan the Terrible was in charge, and we see that it is dangerous to have too much power and to be cruel to your people. Even though Ivan had big dreams and a good start in life, his story ends in tragedy because he gave in to his worst instincts. But even though we're disgusted by the cruelty and chaos caused by this evil czar, we can't help feeling a little sorry for the troubled person under the crown. Ivan was a man of his time, and the violence and intrigue around him from a young age had left its mark on him. It's interesting to think how different his life and rule might have been if he had more love and peace instead of suspicion and conflict. The story of Ivan the Terrible is a good example of how having power can change a person. It makes us think about what we want in a leader and why it's important to balance being strong with being wise, kind, and controlled. Let us hope that the hard lessons of the past can show us the way to a future where rulers are more sensible. And so, as we say goodbye to the story of Tsar Ivan IV, we start to think about the other crazy kings who have also made history. From the hills of Bohemia to the halls of Byzantium, rulers through the ages have struggled with their own personal issues and the heavy responsibility of ruling. Their stories are still very interesting. They make us want to explore the complicated connections between power, personality, and what it means to be human. The life of King Erik XIV of Sweden was full of tragedy and should be a warning to us. Despite being born into a rich family and becoming king, his reign was marked by instability, paranoia, and violence that ultimately led to his downfall. Erik was born in 1533, the oldest son of King Gustav I, who had started the House of Vasa and made Sweden Protestant. When he was young, Erik received an excellent education. He learned several languages, theology, and military tactics. People said he was intelligent, handsome, and charismatic. But there were also early signs of the mental imbalance that would plague his life. After his father died in 1560, Erik became king. This happened in a big way, and people were happy. His coronation was a grand affair that lasted several days. There were feasts, justs, a type of medieval tournament, and masquerades, costume parties. The new king looked very smart in his fancy clothes and jewelry, with his crown on his head. For a short time, it looked like Sweden was entering a golden age. But there was trouble. Erik didn't trust the people around him. He was quick to spot threats and slights, even from his own family. He often had arguments with his brother John, Duke of Finland. He saw John as someone who wanted to take his place as ruler. These tensions would only get worse over time. A turning point in Erik's rule was his relationship with Karen Munn's daughter. Karen was not from a royal family. She was the daughter of a prison guard, which meant she was much more ordinary than Erik. But he really loved her, and in 1567, they secretly got married. This meant that she became Queen of Sweden. The match shocked the nobility, who saw it as an insult to their status and traditions. The arguments about the marriage only made Erik more suspicious. He thought that Karen's critics, including his own family, were planning to hurt him. His behavior became more and more strange. and he had violent outbursts and delusions. He would walk around the castle halls late into the night, talking about conspiracies and betrayals. This tension eventually led to the Stura murders in 1567. In May of that year, several important noblemen of the Stura family were ordered to go to the castle and put in prison by Eric, who accused them of treason. After a few days of being held prisoner, Eric suddenly had them brought to him and, in a fit of rage, stabbed Niels Stura himself. The rest of the men were killed by the guards after Eric's orders. The murders shocked the nation and turned many against Eric for good. His brother John escaped from prison and started to gather supporters to overthrow the increasingly unstable king. For the next year, there was a fight for power until finally, in 1568, John's forces took control of the city. Eric was forced to give up his throne, and John was crowned king in his place. Eric was imprisoned for the rest of his life, moving between various castles and strongholds. Even though he was no longer in charge, Karen stayed loyal to him. She chose to share his prison and try to make him as comfortable as possible. During these difficult years, Eric found comfort in music, playing the lute, and writing songs about his sad situation. As time went on, Eric's mental health got worse and worse. He started to lose touch with reality, sometimes even claiming to be a prophet or even God himself. There were times when he refused to eat, thinking his food was poisoned. His once sharp mind became muddled and full of despair. Eric died in 1577 at the age of 43, probably from arsenic poisoning. People still don't know if this was suicide, an accident from his experiments with alchemy, or murder ordered by his brother John. In hindsight, I feel a bit sorry for Eric XIV. While his actions were clearly cruel and his rule catastrophic for Sweden, he also seems to be a tragic figure undone by mental illness beyond his control. This is a story about a life that was wasted, a life that was ruined by madness and loneliness. In the end, perhaps the kindest thing that can be said of Eric is that he was as much a victim of his own problems as those who suffered under his rule. He had everything, but deep down he felt empty. We will now look at the story of Ivan the Terrible, one of Russia's most famous rulers. Ivan was born in 1530 and was made Grand Prince of Moscow when he was only 3 years old after the death of his father, Vasily III. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, was in charge for a short time, but she also died when Ivan was only 8. This left the young prince in the hands of the Russian nobility, who were fighting each other for power. These rich and powerful people didn't care about Ivan's welfare or education, so he had to look after himself in the dangerous world of the Kremlin court. The future Tsar had a difficult childhood. It was lonely and cold, and full of deprivation, humiliation, and frequent abuse. Ivan would later say how he and his younger brother, Yuri, who was deaf and mute, were often so hungry they had to beg for food from the palace staff. Ivan's difficult childhood certainly had a big effect on him. He grew up alone and did not trust people, especially the nobility who had ignored and mistreated him. Even as a child, there were signs that he would be cruel in the future, like when he was found tormenting small animals just for fun. But Ivan was a smart and ambitious kid. He loved reading, and he read religious texts and historical books just as much. He began to see himself as the chosen ruler of Russia, whose job it was to make the monarchy powerful and respected again, against the people who wanted to take his power. This became true in 1547 when Ivan was officially crowned the first Tsar of all Russia. The ceremony was held at the Dormition Cathedral, and Ivan was just 16 years old. With the tolling of bells and the rising of incense, Russia entered a new age of autocratic rule. Ivan wasted no time in showing everyone who was in charge and beginning his life's work of making Russia bigger. At the start of his reign, he introduced a number of popular reforms. These included changes to the law code, the First National Assembly, and the organization of local government so that the crown had more control. He also led a series of successful military campaigns against the Tartesses to the east and south, taking over large areas of land for Russia. At one time, Ivan was seen as a hero by the Russian people because of the strong leadership he showed and the victories he achieved against the old enemies of Russia. He was very tall, over 6 feet, and had a muscular build. He also had very bright eyes, which made men nervous. He was a very clever speaker. He could make people feel happy or scared, depending on what he wanted. But Ivan was not happy. He often felt very sad and worried, and thought that everyone was out to get him. He was very angry very quickly and would go from being friendly to being violent very quickly. As time went on, these darker feelings would become the most important part of his rule. A big change happened in 1560 when Ivan's first wife, Anastasia Romanova, died. Ivan was overcome with grief and paranoia, convinced that Anastasia had been poisoned by his enemies, the Boyars. He suspected the Romanov family and their allies most, and this led to a cycle of plots, denunciations, and increasingly brutal purges. As time went on, Ivan's rule became more and more strange and cruel. He sent out the infamous Oprichniki, a state within a state that he controlled directly. The Oprichniki were a fanatical military order that lived there. Dressed all in black and riding black horses, the Oprichniki became a symbol of terror. They carried out Ivan's will by torturing people, executing them publicly, and looting their enemies' lands. The most well-known example of their cruelty was the sack of Novgorod in 1570. Ivan thought the city was being treacherous, so he ordered his people to commit shocking atrocities against its inhabitants. Thousands were tortured and killed. Homes and churches were burned, and women and children were violently assaulted. The once great city was reduced to a smoldering ruin, and its fate was a clear warning to anyone who dared to defy the Sith. But even though he caused so much suffering to his own people, Ivan was also a very strange man. He was a very productive writer, creating religious texts, letters, and even poetry, as well as his orders for terror. He would get into heated debates about religion with religious scholars, making it look like he was a strong defender of the Orthodox faith. He also wrote a lot of letters to Queen Elizabeth I of England. In these letters, the two of them chatted, had arguments, and even thought about the possibility of getting married to make their alliance stronger. These attempts at a relationship never worked out, but they show that Ivan could be charming, smart, and likable when he wanted to be. Sadly, Ivan's personal struggles were most intense within his own family. In 1581, he hit his pregnant daughter-in-law during an argument. This caused her to lose the baby. When his eldest son, Ivan Ivanovich, confronted him about this, the Tsar got very angry and beat the young man, killing him with his scepter. Afterwards, Ivan was overcome with grief. He cried over his dead son and asked for forgiveness. But the damage to his reputation and legacy was done. His later heirs were all sickly, and the dynasty would die out soon after Ivan, throwing Russia into the chaos of the time of troubles. In his final years, Ivan's health got much worse very quickly. This was probably made worse by mercury poisoning from his alchemical experiments. He started to spend a lot of time on his own, feeling sad and sorry for his sins. People say he would often ring a special bell to call the people to church, but then he would shout at them for their bad behavior when they got there. Ivan the Terrible died in March 1584, suddenly collapsing while playing a game of chess. The official cause of death was listed as a stroke, but rumors persisted that he had been poisoned by his enemies or that he had taken the poison himself to escape his misery. Whatever the truth, his death marked the end of an important period in Russian history. Looking back, Ivan IV was one of the most complex and controversial rulers Russia has ever had. He made the state stronger and started wars that made Russia a big European power in the centuries that followed. At the same time, his cruel actions and the way he ran the country traumatized Russian society and may have led to a future dictatorship. In Russian folklore, he's been both a great hero and a nasty monster, showing the country's mixed feelings about him. Was he a strong leader who did what had to be done to protect Russia, or a cruel madman who made his country suffer? People still have different opinions about this. It seems clear that Ivan's rule is connected to his deeply damaged mind. A difficult childhood, an abusive and insecure upbringing, the loss of his dear wife, and a life of paranoia and suspicion. All these strange ideas messed with his mind, causing him to do terrible things, even as he tried to do good things. In the end, perhaps Ivan the Terrible is best understood as a tragic figure, like a Shakespearean character, a man of great gifts, but his flaws made him exceptional. His life is a warning about the dangers of having too much power and being an unstable person. It also shows the terrible things that can happen when a leader's problems are allowed to go unchecked. We will now look at some other medieval rulers who were known for being strange or crazy. One such figure is Rudolf II, Holy Roman Emperor from 1576 to 1612. Born into the powerful Habsburg dynasty, Rudolf was a smart and curious man who was fascinated by the arts and sciences. His court in Prague became a popular place for all kinds of artists, alchemists, astronomers, and philosophers, which made the city a lively place to visit. But he was also interested in strange and supernatural things. He was obsessed with collecting rare and unusual objects, everything from ancient artifacts to strange mechanical devices. His palace, the Hatchin, was full of strange and interesting things, including exotic animals, fossils, and tools used to study the stars. It even had what was said to be a unicorn horn. Even more strange were the rumors that Rudolf believed himself to be made of glass. People whispered that the emperor moved carefully through his rooms, afraid of breaking his fragile body. Some even said he had special padded clothing made to protect his glass body. We don't know if the stories are true or if they're just a way of talking about how Rudolf was getting weaker and weaker. What is clear is that, as time went on, Rudolf grew ever more reclusive and detached from the business of governing. He would go into seclusion for days on end, refusing to see anyone, lost in his own mystical pursuits. He was obsessed with alchemy, spending money on the useless idea of turning ordinary metals into gold and making a magic potion to make him live forever. Rudolf's failure to do his duty led to him losing control of his lands and, eventually, his own family. They plotted against him and replaced him with his more sensible and traditional brother, Matthias. Rudolf kept on ruling in Prague until he died in 1612, but he was no longer in charge. Another ruler who often seemed a little confused was Justin II. He was the Byzantine emperor from 565 to 578. He became king after his uncle Justinian I, during a difficult time for the empire. It was struggling with wars, religious conflicts, and it did not have much money. Unfortunately, Justin doesn't seem to have the right skills to deal with these problems. He was strange and irrational almost from the start of his reign. He would make promises that he knew he couldn't keep, get angry very easily, and think that people were out to get him. One strange time was when a group of Armenian envoys came to the capital with gifts for the emperor. For some reason, seeing these men made Justin panic. He started screaming that they were assassins sent to kill him. Then he ordered his guards to attack them. After that, he suddenly fell to the ground, gnawing at the carpet and foaming at the mouth. As Justin's madness got worse, the government's work ground to a halt. He would randomly appoint and dismiss officials, which made it impossible to make any kind of sensible policy. At one point, he became obsessed with the idea of giving up his throne and giving it to a randomly chosen beggar as a holy fool. In the end, Justin was suffocated to death in his bed, possibly on orders from his wife, Sophia, who had been in charge during his increasingly crazy final years. His successor was the very competent General Tiberius II Constantine, who managed to stop the situation from getting worse and keep the empire together. Finally, we come to Charles II, the last Habsburg ruler of Spain. Charles was born into a royal family that was famous for marrying close relatives. The Habsburgs wanted to keep their family's land, so they would marry uncles to nieces and first cousins to each other. The result was that Charles was beset by a shocking array of physical and mental disabilities. His jaw was so deformed that he could barely speak or chew his food. He was short, weak, and often ill with stomach problems. Crui's mind was like a child's, and he was not able to be king. During his rule, Spain was basically run by regents and validos, who were royal favorites. Although Charles was a sad figurehead, he did have a few simple pleasures in life. These included playing with his collection of clocks and watching court dwarves fight mock battles. But he was very aware of the things he was not good at. One time, a French diplomat visited and said nice things about the Escorial Palace outside Madrid. Charles replied, "It is not a palace that belongs to a king. It is a palace that belongs to God and which is inhabited by a foolish person like me." Charles died without having any children in 1700 when he was 38. He had a number of health problems that meant he was unable to have children. The autopsy showed that his body had no blood and his heart was very small. His death led to a big war over who should be the next king of Spain. This was known as the War of the Spanish Succession. These are just a few examples of the many rulers through medieval history who, for one reason or another, earned a place in the history books because of how they behaved or their personal struggles. Sometimes, like with Charles II, they were just born into really difficult situations. With others, like Rudolf II, their strange behavior started out as cute, but eventually got them into trouble and made them unfit to rule. All these examples show how hard it was to be a king in medieval times. These men were often given important jobs when they were young, with no training or help. They were under constant threat from their rivals. Their subjects were always disappointed, and they were always afraid of the gods. We have seen how mental illness can affect a king's ability to rule. For example, with Charles the Mad and Henry V. The fear, paranoia, and strange behavior that often went with these illnesses made their kingdoms more likely to be unstable, invaded, and fight over power. Our next adventure takes us to Scandinavia in the 16th century, where we meet King Erik XIV of Sweden. The son of King Gustav I, Erik had a good start as a king in the Renaissance period when he took the throne in 1560. People said he was intelligent, well-educated, and liked art. His coronation was a big deal, with a 3-day, nighttime party that included feasts, tournaments, and fireworks. But even at this early stage, there were signs that the young king was not doing well. Erik was often sad and would often go into his room for days at a time. He started to distrust the people around him, thinking there were plots and conspiracies everywhere. Erik's rule was also affected by his personal life, which was not easy. He fell in love with Caraman's daughter, even though his advisors did not approve. She was the daughter of a jailkeeper and a commoner, which meant she was much lower in social status than him. Erik secretly married Karen in 1567, which shocked and outraged the court. Some people saw this as a romantic act, going against the strict social rules of the time. Others thought it was more proof of the king's unreliability and poor decision-making. As time went on, Erik's paranoia and strange behavior only got worse. In 1567, Erik believed that several noblemen were planning to overthrow him. He had them put in prison and killed. and this became known as the Stura murders. One of the victims was Niels Svanes Stor, whose wife Elin was rumored to be Eric's mistress. People still debate whether Eric ordered their deaths because he was jealous or because he was scared of a conspiracy. One thing is for sure, the Stuart murders changed things for Eric. The king, who had been celebrated in the past, was now seen as a dangerous and unpredictable tyrant. His brother John, the Duke of Finland, took the chance to get people to support him against him in 1568. Eric was removed from his position of power and sent to prison, with John taking the crown as John III of Sweden. For Eric, it was the start of a long and sad story. He would spend the rest of his life moving between different castles and strongholds. He is like a king without a crown, a prisoner in his own kingdom. Sometimes he was allowed to go out and about, and he was allowed to read books and listen to music. Karen, who he was very close to, was allowed to visit him. But at other times, he had to put up with much worse conditions, and even the embarrassment of being put on display for people to see. Karen was always there for him, even though he was alone and no one else was helping him. She gave birth to several children, but only their daughter Sigrid survived to be a grown-up. In the end, Eric's story is about how someone with mental health issues can mess up their life. The young man who had shown such promise when he took the throne ended his days broken and alone, far from the grand coronation. He died in 1577 at the age of 43, possibly poisoned on the orders of his brother John. It was a sad and shameful end for a man who had once been so powerful and had such a bright future ahead of him. But Eric's story is not the only one of the king who has been defeated by the problems in his own mind. As we move further east towards Russia, we meet a person who is even more cruel and well known for it. Ivan Ivanovich Vasilievich is the name he is known by in history. He is also known as Ivan the Terrible. The nickname he was given shows how he would rule. But when he was young, he did not look like he would become the monster he would later become. Ivan was born in 1530. He was only 3 years old when his father died. His mother, Elonina Glinskaya, took care of him. But Elonina herself died just 5 years later in strange circumstances. This made Ivan's childhood difficult. He was neglected and abused. He also had to compete for power in the Russian court. These early experiences had a big effect on Ivan. When he took the throne in 1547 at the age of 16, he was already showing signs of the paranoia and cruelty that would define his reign. His coronation as the first Tsar of all Russia was a grand event. But Ivan's reputation was tarnished by the execution of several boyars, members of the Russian nobility whom he suspected of disloyalty. But even though things didn't look good at the start, Ivan's early rule also showed some good things. He introduced a number of popular reforms, including changes to the law code, limiting the powers of the boyars, and even calling together Russia's first parliament, the ZKY Sur. He also made Russia bigger by beating the Kates of Kazan and Astron in wars. But these achievements were increasingly overshadowed by Ivan's descent into tyranny and madness. In 1565, after one of his closest advisors went over to Lithuania, Ivan split Russia into two parts. His personal territory is called the Opricina, and the rest of the country is known as the Zakina. The Oprinina was ruled by Ivan's feared Oprichniki, his secret police who were always loyal to him. Dressed all in black and riding black horses, they became a symbol of terror, carrying out Ian's increasingly cruel and random orders. They tortured, murdered, and exiled anyone they thought was a traitor, often for the smallest reason. They even attacked whole cities like Novgorod, which was brutally sacked in 1570 on Ivan's orders. But perhaps the most tragic victim of Ivan's anger was his own family. In 1581, Ivan hit his pregnant daughter-in-law because he was angry. This caused her to lose the baby. When his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, confronted him about this, the Tsar struck him with his scepter, killing him. Ivan was devastated when he lost his heir, and it caused big problems for the future of the Russian monarchy. As Ivan's rule became more unpredictable and cruel, Russia fell into a state of almost constant fear and chaos. The people suffered even more because of famines, epidemics, and foreign invasions. Even the once powerful operniki were not safe. Ivan turned on them in his final years, killing many of them because he thought they were disloyal. Ivan himself died in 1584 while playing a game of chess. There's a story that he died suddenly from an illness, just as he was about to make a clever move. It was strange that he died so quietly, because he had always been a very loud and angry person. Ivan left behind a complicated and bloody legacy. Some people saw him as a cruel and unpredictable ruler, a crazy king who made his own people afraid. To others, he was a strong and effective ruler who made Russia more powerful and prepared it for the future. The truth is usually somewhere in between these two extremes. We know for sure that Ivan's rule had a big, negative impact on Russian history. His cruelty and paranoia were a bad example for future rulers to follow. This made people think that the king was all-powerful and a God-given ruler. This idea would have a big effect on Russian politics and society for hundreds of years. But Ivan was not the only king to be affected by madness. Across Europe, the problem of mental illness would continue to affect those in power. In Bohemia, there was Rudolf II, the emperor who kept to himself and thought he was made of glass. In the Byzantine Empire, Justin II's strange behavior and delusions caused chaos. Charles II of Spain was born with a disability, and his family was full of inbreds. This meant that the Habsburg dynasty, which had been so powerful in the past, was slowly dying out. Each of these kings had their own unique struggles and stories. For example, Rudolf II was a big supporter of the arts and sciences and had lots of alchemists, astronomers, and artists at his court. But he was also very paranoid and refused to let anyone touch him because he was afraid that they would break his glass body. Justin II was known for being very unpredictable and having delusions of grandeur. He once made his pet cat governor of Egypt and would often run through the palace howling like a dog. He was acting so strangely that his wife had to take charge. Charles II was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. Charles was born from generations of inbreeding, which caused him to have a number of physical and mental disabilities. He could hardly speak or walk and often felt very sad or angry. He was unable to produce an heir, which meant the end of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain. These stories are sad, but they also show us the difficult lives of the people who wore the crown. They remind us that even the most powerful and privileged people were not immune to the effects of mental illness and the pressures of their position. These crazy kings show that people can overcome difficult situations. Even though they had a hard time, many of them still went on to become important in history, either in a good way or a bad way. They built amazing palaces, supported the arts, and changed the course of nations. Their stories, however sad, are an important part of the history of the human race. As we finish our look at the lives of these kings who had a hard time, it's good to think about what we can learn from their stories. Maybe they show that it's important to be kind and understand other people, even if you have power. Maybe they're trying to warn us about the problems of giving too much power to one person and the importance of setting limits, even for the most important positions. Or maybe they just show us a more complex and human view of history, one that recognizes the weaknesses and mistakes of even the most successful people. These kings were not just rulers. They were also human beings with all the complexities and contradictions that this implies. As we go to sleep, let's think about these stories and the lessons they teach us. Let's imagine a world where strength is balanced with kindness, where even the strongest people can be understood and shown mercy. And so, good night, dear listener. I hope your dreams are full of hope for a kinder, gentler world, not the fear of cruel tyrants. You can relax, safe in the knowledge that the mad kings of the past are now just a thing of the past, and that a new day is here, full of hope and potential. Good night and sweet dreams. As we talked about in the last part, mental illness could have a big effect on medieval kings, and this could lead to terrible results for the king and the kingdom. But being crazy was not the only thing that could make someone a bad ruler. Cruelty, selfishness, and incompetence were also part of the picture of medieval kings and queens. One king who had several of these bad qualities was John, who was king of England from 1199 to 1216. John was the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. He was never expected to inherit the throne, but after his older brother, Richard the Lionheart, died, John became king. From the beginning, he didn't seem right for the job. John had a talent for making enemies and losing friends. He was known for being cruel and petty. One time, he ordered the capture of a particularly annoying archdeacon and had him crushed to death under tons of weight. He also had a habit of seducing, or some say, assaulting the wives and daughters of his barons. This made him unpopular with the nobility. But it was John's mess-up during the war with France that really made him infamous. Because of a series of mistakes in the military and in diplomacy, John lost most of England's territory in mainland Europe, including Normandy and Anjou, which were his ancestors' lands. This was very bad for the reputation and money of the English crown. When John tried to raise money and stop people who disagreed with him, it made things even worse. He was in constant conflict with the barons and the church. He tried and failed to install his own archbishop, which made Pope Innocent III put England under a strict rule that stopped people from practicing their religion. In 1215, things got really bad. A group of barons who were against the king started a war against him. John was in a position of power, but there were many more people on the other side. This meant he had to sign the Magna Carta, which was a document that limited the power of the king. But John broke the deal very quickly. The Magna Carta became an important part of English law and a symbol of the fight against unfair rule. But John's story doesn't end there. John wanted to take back the lands he had lost in France. He started a new campaign across the Channel. John got sick while he was looting in the Lyre Valley. The evil, as one person said, would be the end of him. John died a sad death, his body covered in a fever and his bowels turning to water. It was a shameful end for a king whose reign had almost destroyed England. John didn't do well as a ruler. He was cruel, reckless, and bad at being king. But, strangely, it was his lack of skill that led to the signing of the Magna Carta, a document that would change English history and encourage the fight for freedom for many years to come. As we say goodbye to bad King John, we think about how unpredictable history can be. A terrible king, because of things he did not do, accidentally made something great happen. It shows that even in the worst times in the past, there were moments of hope and progress. And with that thought, we'll drift off to sleep, letting the sand of time carry us away. Talking about dark chapters, the next king in our gallery of bad guys is a figure shrouded in a sinister legend. Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, is better known to history by his ominous nickname, Vlad the Impaler. His story takes us to the violent border areas of Eastern Europe in the 15th century. Vlad was born into a noble family in Wallachia, a principality between the Christian kingdoms of Hungary and Poland and the expanding Ottoman Empire. It was a difficult situation, and he needed a ruler as tough as the enemies on the borders. Wallachia found a prince in Vlad, who was more than capable. Vlad had known violence and brutality from a very young age. When he was a child, he and his younger brother Radu were taken to the Ottoman court as hostages. This was a common practice at the time to make sure that vassal states were loyal. There, Vlad saw for himself how cruel and violent the Ottomans were. When Vlad finally became king of Wallachia in 1456, he was determined to rule very strictly. He was under threat from the Ottomans, from other noble families, and from anyone who dared to challenge his authority. He met these threats with a unique and violent style of fighting that made him a legend. Vlad liked to kill people by pushing them up onto a pole. The death was slow and painful. It involved driving a sharp stake through the victim's body. He was so enthusiastic about his punishment that he would impale hundreds or even thousands at a time. The sight of Vlad's so-called forests of impaled corpses was a grim warning to anyone who would cross him. But Vlad was cruel not just to get what he wanted. It seemed to be a strange kind of pleasure for him. He was seen eating with the people he had killed, dipping his bread in their blood. He once locked a group of beggars in a banquet hall and burned them alive, saying he was freeing them from their misery. Even by the brutal standards of the time, Vlad's cruelty was shocking. But even though he was cruel, Vlad was also a clever and effective ruler. He was a skilled warrior who won several important battles against the Ottomans. He also worked to make Wallachia's defenses stronger and increase his own power. In a region full of foreign invaders and civil war, Vlad managed to keep Wallachia safe, but it cost him dearly. Vlad's cruel rule ended in 1476, when he was killed in a battle against the Ottomans. The story goes that his head was cut off and sent to Constantinople as a trophy. But even after his death, Vlad's dark reputation only got bigger. Over the next few hundred years, he became a well-known character in stories and was the inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula and many other scary stories. As we forget about Vlad the Impaler, we must think about what is evil and the difference between being cruel and having to be cruel. In a time and place where violence was often the only way to gain power, Vlad used it in a very cruel way that still shocks and horrifies us today. But his story also shows us how difficult it is to make a tyrant. The difficult situations of a dangerous world, the problems of a violent childhood, and the heavy responsibilities of leadership. Now we must let go of our sad thoughts and go to sleep. Good night, and may your dreams be gentler than the violent nightmares of history. As we have seen, Ivan the Terrible's reign was a very bad time for Russia. He showed promise as a strong ruler who made big changes, but in his later years he became paranoid, cruel, and tyrannical. The death of his dear wife, Anastasia Romanova, made him feel very upset. He started to behave more and more strangely, and he became violent. The story goes that in 1565, Ivan formed the Opushniki, his own loyal band of secret police dressed in black and riding black horses. They did what Ivan wanted, scaring the boys and peasants and taking their land and money for themselves. Ivan was very angry with some towns, like Novgorod. He attacked and destroyed them, killing many of the people living there. Most tragically of all, in 1581, Ivan's violent temper turned on his own family. The Tsar attacked his daughter-in-law, who was pregnant, and she lost the baby. When his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, confronted him about it, Ivan hit him on the head with his scepter, a long staff used to symbolize royal power, in a fit of rage. The blow was the last straw. The young Tsarevich died a few days later, leaving Ivan very sad and sorry. The Tsar got much weaker and his mind got clouded as he got older. He got really sick and in a lot of pain, and he had some really bad rages. Some historians think he may have been poisoned, perhaps by one of his many enemies. Ivan was on his own and felt paranoid. He carried on attacking people, even though he was getting weaker. Legend has it that on March 18th, 1584, Ivan was playing chess when he suddenly fell ill. The Tsar fell over onto the chessboard, scattering the pieces onto the floor. His doctors tried their best to save him, but he never regained consciousness. Ivan the Terrible, the Tsar of all Russia, died at the age of 53. Ivan IV left behind a complicated legacy. He made Russia bigger, made Tsar more powerful, and introduced popular reforms in his early years, but he later became cruel and crazy, which had a negative effect. The trauma of the opera and the years of terror would leave a lasting mark on Russia. Let's talk about some other rulers who were a bit strange. First, there was Rudolf II, who was the Holy Roman Emperor from 1576 to 1612. Rudolf was a big fan of the arts and sciences, and he collected lots of interesting things in his castle in Prague. But Rudolf was also a deeply troubled man. He was very private and liked to stay away from the business of ruling. He spent most of his time with his collections. He suffered from bouts of severe depression and melancholy and became fascinated by the occult, alchemy, and astrology. Most curiously, Rudolf began to think that he was made of glass and could shatter at any moment. He started wearing lots of padding under his clothes to protect his fragile glass body. Servants were told to whisper in the emperor's presence so that their voices would not make him angry. As he got older, Rudolf's mental health got worse and worse. He became very angry, spoke to himself, and started to feel very suspicious. His family and the court did not like the way he behaved. This allowed his relatives, who were more able to take his power. When Rudolf died in 1612, he left the empire in a state of crisis and upheaval. The same was true across the continent in the Byzantine Empire. Another ruler was going mad in the 6th century AD. Justin II was a good ruler at first. He made peace with the Persians. But a few years later, Justin's behavior became strange. He started acting irrationally, not recognizing old friends and getting extremely angry. He laughed and cried with such intensity that he could not control them. He even barked like a dog during audiences and bit his attendants when they tried to stop him. As Justin became more and more unhinged, the empire fell apart. The government suddenly stopped working. The army was not being paid, and the Avars and Slavs were a threat to the frontiers. Eventually, Justin's wife Sophia made a plan with the ailing emperor's friend Tiberius to replace Justin. They ruled as his regents until his death in 578. Later in 17th century Spain, the last Habsburg ruler, Charles II, was given the unflattering nickname, the Bewitched. Charles was born in 1661. He was the result of many years of the Spanish Habsburgs breeding with each other. They wanted to make sure that their family line was kept pure. Because of this, Charles had a number of physical and developmental disabilities. He didn't learn to walk until he was 8 or speak properly until he was 10. His tongue was so big that he found it hard to eat and talk. He had stomach problems and epileptic seizures. What was most obvious was that his jaw was very pronounced, so he couldn't close his mouth properly. Charles's disabilities meant he was unable to rule effectively. He was controlled by different groups in the court who used him for their own purposes. When asked who should take over from him as his health was failing, he allegedly replied, "I don't know. I'm only a fool." When Charles II died in 1700 without having any children, he was the last of the Spanish Habsburg line. The question of who would succeed him led to a major European conflict, the War of the Spanish Succession. His death marked the end of an important period in the life of the royal family, which had been affected by inbreeding. As we've explored these stories of crazy kings and queens, there are a few things we've noticed. The huge pressure of being king, often starting when they were young, caused many kings to have problems with their mental health. In a time before we understood mental illness very well, their strange behavior could have very bad results for their lands. Their stories also show how important it was for medieval rulers to have a competent male heir. If there is no clear way for someone to take over, there is often a lot of fighting for power. We can see this in the history of France with Charles the Mad and in England with Henry V. Looking back now, it's hard not to feel sorry for these tragic figures dealing with personal issues in a very public way. Some leaders, like Ivan the Terrible, use their power to hurt others. Others, like Justin II and Charles II, seem to be powerless against their problems. These crazy kings and queens show us that even the strongest rulers can have their weaknesses. Even though they were very rich and important, kings were still as likely as anyone else to get sick or be hurt. As we come to the end of our look at some strange stories from medieval history, I hope you have found these stories of crazy kings and bad reigns interesting. They show you the difficult lives of old rulers with just enough excitement to stop you from falling asleep. And with that, our tour of strange rulers and medieval craziness has come to an end. If you like this bedtime story about history, maybe you'll come with me again sometime. If you'd like to hear more fun stories about the past and long-dead kings, please like or subscribe. Or if my long-winded talk has proven to be a reliably soporific tonic. But for now, as the medieval world fades into the mists of dreams, I say good night and wish you a peaceful and stable slumber than our poor mad monarchs. Sweet dreams.